There's a few slides I wanted to show you, which gives a bit of a flavour of the research that BESA provides for its members. And as subscribers to the Launchpad service, you can actually go on our website and access our archive of research, which goes back over 20 years, and actually has a very rich, otherwise inaccessible series of presentations, surveys and reports into the way in which the UK market is performing. There's international briefings in there, and increasingly there's going to be new pieces of research, for example, on procurement in multi-academy trusts, which will be looking very much at how the new school structure is going to be procuring going forward, because there is a wholesale shift at the moment that's taking place from the local education authority procurement process to that of the procurement process within individual academies and also within multi-academy trusts. So there's a lot of change happening in the sector at the moment. It is quite a depressed market in the UK. And actually, when I start to walk you through this research, my intention isn't to depress you. There is some kind of bad news at the moment in terms of the ICT sector within the UK, but there are many opportunities as well. It's important that we at BESA tell it like it is. So we don't shy away from the fact that head teachers or heads of ICT are saying that they're going to be spending less over the next couple of years. But at the same time, I think it's very, very important that we say this isn't a time for doom and gloom. This is a time for actually thinking, how do we come up with products that better suits teachers' needs? This is a time for also thinking, as was mentioned in the last session, how we might be able to start to export overseas at an early stage within a startup's journey, an education company's journey. Because I think certainly during the recession, we saw that the companies that really performed the best and really did well out of that period were the ones that didn't just look at the UK market and batten down the hatches, but also did start to engage with the overseas market. And I think there actually is an unparalleled opportunity to do so today. But I wanted to just walk you through, this is our annual research into the ICT state school sector, which is based upon a representative sample survey of primary schools and secondary schools and weighted to the primary and secondary school population at large. So this gives the researchers, who are C3 education, pretty much a 95% certainty that this is quite accurate in terms of what's going to happen. And they've been doing this for us for 20 years now and have a very good track record of mapping out the trends. So I think we can speak with some authority that this is what the outlook is over the coming year. And the outlook, I'm afraid to say, is that we do have about a quarter of schools, 31% of primary schools and about a quarter of secondary schools now saying they're planning to significantly downgrade their ICT investments over the coming year. And about another third saying, yes, they're going to downgrade, but only a little. Having said that, the highest proportion of schools are saying it is the same as expected. But that proportion is actually much smaller than the previous year. And you'll see these numbers in the circles here are the previous year's percentages. So you'll see it's dropped from 44% in primary schools to 33%, and then from 57% in secondary schools to now 40%. So it is a tough year ahead for schools. And one of the drivers for this, and we can talk about this later on, is the fact that during the autumn statement last year, there was not an actual cut in the overall education budget, but there was a freezing of the overall education budget over the next periods. And what we're seeing at the moment is actually a bit of a baby boom within education. A lot of new pupils coming into the system, which means that because education budgets are frozen, per pupil, the amount of expenditure is going to decline. And that's an important dynamic when it comes to ICT, but actually when it comes to education budgets as a whole. So what's going to be affected by the negative changes in ICT investments? Well, actually, I mean, this is primary here. I'll turn to secondary in a minute. But you'll see actually that assessment is pretty safe. In fact, we're getting feedback from a lot of our members at the moment that we're seeing quite a considerable uptick in assessments. So those in that space are actually riding through the kind of post-Brexit months so far quite well. And they've had quite a good back-to-school period. When it comes to pupil devices, teacher devices or classroom ICT, not so good. You're seeing at least a third saying they're going to be downgrading their investments within primary schools. And then, about a quarter of schools saying they're going to downgrade their digital content and learning platform expenditure as well. And this is the same picture in secondary schools. fact, very, very similar, except actually there's less of a desire to downgrade when it comes to digital content or learning platforms. Again, one of the good news stories that's coming out of this is actually both expenditure on broadband and Wi-Fi is very unlikely to be affected by this, but actually broadband and Wi-Fi penetration, which has historically been particularly bad in primary schools in particular, is actually likely to, is forecast to improve quite considerably over the next couple of years, which I think is something that BESA can take some solace from. We've been banging the drum very loudly about this at the BET Show and other places, and I think it's a very positive story that schools are finally managing to get the access that they need. So again, in terms of maintaining ICT investments in 2017 to 18, you've actually only got around 10% of primary schools and secondary schools saying, yes, we're definitely going to maintain our ICT investments. You've got just over a third saying probably, and then about a third saying unlikely, and less than 10% saying definitely not. And how well resourced are they with selected technologies? Well, let's have a look. So when it comes to desktop PCs, pretty well resourced. About 85% of primary schools say they're well resourced. And that's likely to kind of remain pretty constant over time. Same with laptops. About 42% of primary schools say they're well resourced. Looks like there's going to be quite a big uptick in primary schools' use of tablets over the next year or so. So that's certainly something to watch out for. Wi-Fi again, a substantial 9 percentage point increase. And then really quite strikingly, an 18 percentage point increase in broadband within primary schools, which again I think is a very positive step forwards and something that we should welcome. Secondary schools, a slightly different picture, not the big increases that we've seen in tablets and Wi-Fi, but still pretty good Wi-Fi penetration, up to 80% by 2017, almost 100% broadband penetration, which you would expect within a secondary school, but it's good to actually see the stats bear that out. Laptops actually around the same as primary schools, so around 45%. And this is quite interesting in terms of whether or not you have good access, depending on whether or not you're a teacher or a pupil. Because you'll see, despite the fact that both primary schools and secondary schools say they actually are well resourced when it comes to even desktop computers, when it comes to access for pupils rather than just teachers, it seems that's pretty low in primary schools. So only about 50% of primary schools now are saying they actually have strong computer access for pupils, which is pretty low if you think about it. Again, internet access still pretty low. A slightly better picture really for secondary schools. But even so, still there are 20% of secondary schools that are saying they don't have good computer access at the moment. And in terms of access to digital content, there has been a lot of investment in this in previous years. Actually, we're not seeing the uptick that you might want to have seen. This is an interesting chart. Certainly, if I think back to my school years when you spent very little time in front of a computer, now actually pupils are spending, in both primary and secondary schools, over 50% of their time engaging with ICT in an average school week. So 54% within primary schools, 56% within secondary schools. And you wonder if that will actually bottom out at some point. So actually in terms of assessment, there was an issue back in 2014 that primary school teachers in particular really needed training in assessment, because of course there's one thing about schools subscribing to assessment providers using ICT. There's another issue of course around teachers actually being properly trained to use it. And it's actually a better news story in 2016, in that actually, while you still have a considerable number of teachers who do need training in primary schools on assessment solutions, that is diminishing over time and diminishing even further in the secondary sector. In terms of use of digital content, actually we're seeing an expansion of primary school teachers saying that they need training in the use of digital content, which I think is striking. But again, there's a contraction within secondary. And then we actually asked some questions this year for the first time around e-safety, which is becoming obviously a pressing issue within schools, but they do feel under-resourced and in need of training on this. So around 50% of all teachers are considered to be in need of e-safety training. And this actually comes up several times within the the more substantial research report that you could download online, where this is becoming a barrier to, for example, the move to more online usage of both software, but also of kind of cloud computing as well. So what are their key ICT challenges over the next 12 months? Funds is an obvious one, but it's not actually the greatest challenge that is raised by both primary and secondary school heads. It's training in ICT resources. They actually feel they don't have adequate training in order to really maximise their value and their impact upon the classroom. I won't dwell too long on a few of these slides, but I think it's also important to look at how many computers are ineffective. There's a lot of stats out there about the volume of computers within schools and the volume of expenditure on computers within schools. Actually, we're having schools say that there's quite a high proportion of computers within schools are currently not really fit for purpose anymore. In an average secondary school in this year, it's anticipated that there's 121 computers in an average secondary school that are no longer fit for purpose. So there's a lot of waste there at the moment. And then in terms of the trends over time, you'll see there was obviously a very big downturn during the recession in terms of ICT expenditure. And then that really has soared over recent years. It's been a very positive few years for the sector. But now, especially following the majority Conservative government, which was a surprise to schools last year, and last year's autumn statement, which I said put a freeze on education budgets, and now the deep uncertainty around the Brexit vote, we are seeing that starting to dip. We can talk a little bit around what schools have allocated for an ICT budget both this year and next year, but certainly in terms of primary schools, we've seen a decline in about 4.5% in terms of overall expenditure. Secondary schools, actually greater, 7% decline. You'll see that decline is set to continue over the next school year, with a 3.7% decline in primary and a 5.6% decline in secondary. So it is tough times. I mean, what Steve said in the last session is right. I mean, we do have a depressed market within the UK. That doesn't mean, however, that there is no opportunity there. There's still a tremendous amount that is being spent both by primary schools and by secondary schools within this sector. I think the challenge is to make sure that, as a colleague said the other day, the cream rises to the top during these periods, and to make sure that we're really providing the very best service and demonstrating the efficacy of that service. And products, and there certainly is still money available within the sector to be able to procure new goods and existing goods that are being produced. And just finally, in terms of the distribution of the ICT budgets, you'll see that the highest proportion of that budget is being spent on computers, system software less so, about 21%, then support around 15%, and then peripherals and networking also around 15%. This is just to give you a flavour of the research. I mean, I was wary of death by PowerPoint, but we do have some very, very rich data on this, that a lot of our companies will actually start to kind of use in terms of budget projections over the next year. We actually also have quarterly barometers, not in such rich detail as this, but barometers that go out on a quarterly basis to a representative sample of head teachers in the primary and secondary sector and ask what they're going to be spending their money on over the next period and how much they're going to spend. So if you go on our website, which all of you have access to for free, you'll be able to get quite a rich insight into how head teachers are planning to spend their money and what the forecast is over the coming periods. But I really want to, at this point, hand over to Dom and Sophie in particular and get your views on not just the impact of this upon suppliers, but also potentially for schools as well.
I work for one of the big 5 multi-academy trusts called United Learning, which also has within it 14 independent schools, which gives a kind of unique perspective and some very stark differences there between those two markets. So I think the funding picture is probably worse than this data suggests, and possibly better in many ways as well. I think head teachers' ability to know what their budgets are going to be next year, in my experience, isn't huge. I've been at United Learning now for 4 years. In the first 3 years I was there, they were consistently, every single academy school, saying, we haven't got enough money, and then they'd get to August and end up in surplus. That was just the behaviour of schools. Until last year, when they said exactly the same thing and were surprised by a deficit. Last year, or the year that's just ended financially for academies was the first bad one. This one here is going to be equally poor. I think schools are very badly equipped again to react agile lead to that. About 80% of costs are tied up in staff, as you probably know. They're the last things to go. They won't get rid of teachers until there's absolutely no choice. The first thing they'll stop doing is buying new things, and new computers are things that they won't buy. The second thing they'll do is stop buying services, so new bits of software, and they'll review very heavily the software they are using. There's a couple of things that I think are a bit immune to that. Most schools will never stop licensing their Office productivity suite and associated services, because that change is too big to countenance. And similarly, it takes a very brave head teacher to think about all the money being poured into their MIS system and associated add-ons, because their MIS system isn't very good and is pretty inaccessible to their staff. So they won't ever change MIS no matter how much it costs them, despite prompting. And why I think it might be slightly better, just to challenge you, Patrick, there is this bulge of pupils that are coming through. Whilst, yes, statistically, the per pupil funding is going to look lower, there's an awful lot of schools out there that are half full and very inefficient. So they're staffed to have classes of 30 and they've got classes of 25. So as those classes fill up, actually those schools have got more money and will be spending it to make those teachers' jobs easier. And I think the main, if we come back to, I'll finish with something about staffing. So workforce is a huge challenge for the sector. You mentioned some training figures, which are depressingly familiar and haven't changed, I think, in decades, really. And the people I'm seeing coming into the profession are no more adept than the people who've been there for 10, 20, 30 years. They're really, this myth of digital natives, which we know doesn't exist, certainly hasn't translated into a workforce that's competent or confident with IT. Where there is growth, I think, and maybe some hope for software producers, maybe if not for the sector, is that the real lack of quality teachers of maths and English that is now starting to be felt by every school in the country. And that is one export we're very good at, actually. They're leaving the country in droves. That is being capitalised on by people who are effectively outsourcing high quality maths and English teaching to software products. Where those products are highly effective, they're adding real value, and children are making progress they wouldn't be able to make, because even though a school may have 5 really good maths teachers, it probably needs 10. And products that really support the work of those maths teachers outside the classroom are valued and are bought and won't be let go. They'll find the money for things like that. Sophie.
Cool. Thanks, BESA, for inviting me to speak as well. First thing was just to have a bit of a shout out for the startups, because I know that recently there was the big news story about teachers working 60 hours a week, and I think it's important to recognise that also the startups here are probably matching those numbers for education innovation. In terms of what I took from the report, although there's a drop, there's a shift perhaps from hardware across to software. So perhaps you've had a sort of saturation of devices into the market, and people now looking to quality content for those devices. And the question, I suppose, for everyone to answer here is, what is that content? And is it something that teachers can really make the most of? So key ICT challenges that I had down were really the training around that as well. So people are looking at, I think we mentioned about ineffective devices. So there's a sort of millions of ineffective devices potentially, but how many more are actually technically competent devices in the sense that they work, but ineffective in the sense that we don't have the training package around them to actually mean that they're effective. And then funds as well. So what I really took from that is that if you're working on the software side and on the content side, there's an opportunity, but I think it's making that sort of decent from the teacher's perspective or the administrative perspective as well.
Question for Dom about the computer marketplace. Are you buying Chromebooks? Are you buying laptops still? Desktops? Is there a kind of new world that's much cheaper, that's more accessible, that kids are bringing their own? How's that working within your academies?
In academies, generally they're doing what they've always done, which is sweat an aging PC asset estate. They're doing that by buying SSD drives, getting them a couple of years out of it, but that's a kind of event horizon that they're not going to be able to escape. Eventually all that stuff's going to stop working. With this downgrading of investment that Patrick's illustrated, particularly in primary, they haven't got the money, there's no big pot, they haven't been saving up their close to deficit every year. What are they going to do? So I think there's a real opportunity for what in the old days you'd have called thin clients, but now Chrome boxes basically, and Chromebooks. That's we haven't seen the impact of that in this country, and we have in the States, and I think that's a couple of years off breaking through here, particularly as the primary sector has always been more embracing of opportunities and risks like that. And I think we'll see it first there, and lots of our primary schools are experimenting with that. As you saw also from the stats, I think there's something like 900,000 iPads out there now in UK schools, and half of those are in primary schools. That tablet revolution has been huge. They won't stop buying those things either, but only in small numbers. Generally there's one in every room, and sometimes there are 8 or 9. In the independent market, really interestingly, just as a contrast to that, every single successful independent school that we work with that can afford to has given every child an iPad. And that is just consistent hygiene factor stuff in that market. You have to be there, else you're dead in the water. And those are the kind of bald marketing facts of it, but actually they're reaping huge educational benefit from it as well. It's actually proven to be a very, very useful thing to do. And I raise that because no or very few state schools are in a position to do that or have the guts to do it, really, in a kind of high accountability environment. So it's a massive opportunity cost. We've got children who, 7% of this country's children go to independent schools, and their experience of education is massively empowering, generally. And in the state sector, they come to school and everything gets turned off and they get talked at. And 50% of their time is spent in front of ICT. Yes, a teacher with a whiteboard. It's very, very kind of chalk and cheese. I hope that answers your question.
I do a lot of stuff out in the US, and Google actively pushed out the Chromebook and it started displacing the iPad. Do you see a trend here where the large players, be it Google, Intel or Microsoft, are going to end up dictating, because of freebies, what happens inside the classroom?
It's an interesting one. I mean, I think there's also some new players coming in, so people like PyTop, or where the margin is a lot smaller. So I think that in the workshops and situations I've been where there are teachers and talking about their experiences, it does quite often go back to Microsoft or Google, and also with iPads as well. So I think, like you say, because the services are free and because there's a relative acceptance of, I understand this product, so I might use it in my own personal life. I think that certainly does play a factor in the conversations that I've heard.
Yeah, to take Google and Microsoft, actually, they've both publicly committed to not making money out of the educational services and not using the data either. Kind of forced admissions from both of those companies that they wouldn't give, I think, in the commercial sector. So do I see them exerting influence? Yeah, they're trying to create next year's customer, of course. But I think that's something that we can take advantage of educationally. If we're not spending, I don't know, £15,000 on average as a secondary school licensing Office, and instead we're using Google Apps and saving those £15,000, I think a lot of schools will see that as a real incentive. I think the other point to pick up on is the proliferation of broadband and wireless, which has now reached a stage where schools can make use of browser-based tools in ways they haven't ever before. So the software as a service market really is at a stage where it could take advantage of that. Schools have been very, very slow to move over to cloud-based things, though. They are really worried about the risk of their broadband going down, even though that's far less likely than their local electricity generator going down. That's the real risk. And they don't really understand the benefits either. I mean, apocryphally, I've heard of schools that have been hit by, not within my group, gladly, by malware this year, for example, and haven't had effective backup and have lost all of their data, and irrecoverably so. And if they'd been in the cloud with their MIS or with their, if they'd been using OneDrive, then actually they'd have been pretty secure against that. But so there's a misunderstanding of the threats and the opportunities there.
I think one of the trends we're seeing over time actually is players such as Microsoft actually relinquishing control. So actually, rather than dictating certainly the content that's being used or even the format of the content, they are starting to become more relaxed about that. And if you look, for example, at Microsoft's kind of old Partners in Learning network, which it's invested many hundreds of millions in over the last 10 years, initially they started off basically saying to teachers, you can use the network, but you can only use Microsoft formats, so PowerPoint, Word, etc., in order to share them. That's now totally changed, so they're taking a much more open approach, and I think you're seeing that in other platforms as well. And part of the reason for that is, and we learnt this very early on when I was working at TES, is that actually if you try and impose certain constraints upon teachers, either with the devices or with in terms of the content, they'll either stop using you or they'll use you in ways that you don't want. And actually, I think one of the reasons why I think Sophie's right, one of the reasons why a lot of the devices and a lot of the equipment that's available within schools is seen to be ineffective may well be because they're basically bought as a kind of a panacea by schools. The sense is you could make this big investment in tablets and suddenly the standards of education will go up, and actually the teachers either don't know what to do with them or they're not comfortable using them at the moment. So I think one of the things that companies are learning over time is actually the importance of remaining deeply engaged with teachers and not putting either artificial or imposing constraints on them. So I'm not too worried about these players actually being dictatorial in terms of the content, certainly, because I think they've learned the hard way in terms of trying to do that over the past decade.
It's interesting in terms of talking about restraints as well, because statistics around lack of pupil access to internet in primary school, I just wondered if that was more to do with safeguarding and that kind of thing, and if you had any insight on whether that's actually the sort of the school becoming that barrier.
Where it tends to be a real problem is in rural primary schools. So less so, of course, in inner city London. But where the issue is with broadband in particular is primary schools that are in the countryside where the entire area around it, surrounding area, does not have good broadband provision. So it is a very real challenge. But having said that, I think it's a challenge we certainly need to rise to, both, as an industry, but also as a country, because, certainly even within Africa now, they're thinking of innovative solutions. Google is working on a project at the moment to put balloons into the stratosphere in order to make sure that African countries have strong access to broadband. If you can have that kind of innovation going on in Africa, if in Scandinavia now access to good broadband is actually being talked about as a human right, then you really think it's not beyond the bounds of the UK government, but also the industry, to make sure that pupils have access to broadband within classrooms.
Although the SpaceX rocket blowing up done for some of that, but yeah.
In terms of?
In terms of their assistance with broadband in Africa, but
I think it's important to think big. I mean, you're always going to get these kind of issues, but I think there is a strong drive to try and innovate and resolve these issues.
It's probably not the number one priority in schools right now.
Many head teachers don't mention the loss of Google's satellite and SpaceX.
Interesting nonetheless.
Thank you all, first of all. Two things really. One is, I wonder at what point in the survey you start asking the question about efficacy of EdTech within those schools. Like, do you actually see it, being effective or not? And then more question, I guess, in United Learning. With budgets being tight, how much are you talking about efficacy of some of the new things that you're buying?
Yeah, so pretty much that's the first question that every head asks me whenever I come and visit their school. So yeah, that's all very nice, but where's the impact? Which is an easy trope to kick around. It's a bit of a false dichotomy, as I'm sure we all know. It's really not about the technology, it's not about the software, it's about how well it's used. All of the evidence that there is about educational impact of anything, which is very, very thin anyway, points towards certain sub-processes within teaching and learning, which we do understand quite well. So I'm sure you're familiar with the work of people like John Hattie and the effect sizes that he uncovered in the last decade, which gives us an insight into the things that do work in schools and learning. One of those being effective feedback, a really good example that if we mark really well, get it to children quickly, encourage them to respond, allow their parents into that process, then actually, surprise, surprise, surprises no one really, the learning happens. Now that doesn't happen pen and paper, because anyone who's ever marked a book will know that sense of dread that you get when you realise that what you've just wasted another hour of your life doing something that will have no impact. But when you translate it into a software process, so we could use all sorts of examples. Show My Homework's probably the most famous one in this country, which has been very successful, and even our most stubbornly conservative of head teachers have bought that generally, because they can see, here's a process that I understand has an impact on learning. Here's something that makes it better. I'm therefore investing in that, because there is EdTech efficacy as a great example. But as we saw from the OECD last September, I think, spending money on technology doesn't produce change. Why would it? We are obviously very focused on that, and half of my job actually is stopping people from buying stuff that is the result of a vanity meeting with the head and someone who come and said, you really need this. And my questions are, why do you need this? And unless they can link it back to something that they actually is a weakness within the school and an educational objective of theirs, then we try and stop it from happening.
Discussion around efficacy really raises the question about what is education for and what it's trying to achieve. There's a very good point made from the floor that actually some of the countries that do the best in PISA, like China, for example, are some of the least equipped when it comes to education technology at the moment, certainly when it comes to advanced education technology. So this question is, well, if we're striving to have an impact and to go up the PISA rankings, then actually shouldn't we be emulating some of the countries that aren't using education technology? There's a real question around what are we actually striving to achieve when we talk around about impacts? It's very easy to talk about driving up standards of education within the classroom. It's very hard to actually define what that actually means, especially in the sector which is quite as nebulous as education technology, for example, because they're not every EdTech device. I'm sure many of the people in this room have different devices that are having an impact in very different ways. So it is very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to measuring efficacy. Having said that, I don't think that's something we should move away from. I think it is very important that we don't just look at usage. We actually do think about how EdTech devices are actually having an impact and whether or not the considerable expenditure, because it may be dropping, but there's a lot of expenditure that is taking place within the UK at the moment, is actually making a difference. So we have to grapple with these questions, but I think there are no real easy answers. And it has to be said, certainly when we went on the EdTech mission to China in September, in Shanghai, we were saying, well, you're the best in the world in maths. There was a certain strong sense from the teachers, the educationalists we were talking to there, that they'd all still rather send their kids over to have a British education. And certainly some of the things they were talking about were the fact that British education teaches creativity, teaches critical thinking in a way that the PISA rankings don't currently capture, and actually in a way that is perhaps more intangible when it comes to measurement.
No, it's definitely true. I was in a meeting yesterday with a Chinese investor, and they're absolutely on the lookout for quality UK EdTech products because they see that as an extension of Britishness and that export value. So I think from that point of view, then there's a lot of opportunity there, certainly.
I don't know if anyone remembers BESA. That was an organisation that the government invested in back when it thought there was a role for technology and education in this country. Sorry, that was slightly harsh, but anyone who's been around for a while will know how much money was pumped into it, and it was trying to find a link, which it didn't find. One of the things it did discover, though, is that effective schools, so schools that had been graded outstanding by Ofsted, typically were also schools that had got the ICT mark, which was their badge of you're using technology well. So there is definitely a correlation between schools that are effective and schools that see technology as part of that effectiveness. So in my context, the schools that are doing best maybe aren't using technology hugely, but the stuff they are using, they're certainly using it for the right reason. They've identified it as having an absolute fitting a hole that they've got, and they're using it aggressively in a very focused way. So the discerning application of technology is what we're after, and that's what that OECD report basically concluded. It started off with a headline, technology makes no difference, and you read past that and it said, but if you use it well, it certainly does.
I'm Justin from the Educational App Store. I just wanted to highlight from the panel highlight to the panel that I represent also a large community of EdTech founders that are working very hard in the UK to get their technology into schools and to work with the ecosystem so that they can export it. One of the things that I do consider is that when we talk about the bigger companies that are coming to our shores and giving away things for free, that's not really a sustainable ecosystem. So we do need to make sure that we are looking after our own so that we can export quality goods and services, but we can only do that if we have an open dialect and communication between everybody in the system. So I wanted just to point that out.
Hello. I was interested to know if there were any stats around students using devices at home as part of beyond the walls classroom learning.
That's not something we capture in this research at the moment, but I think it's a very good point. In fact, increasingly, obviously, the kind of lines between home tuition and parent engagement in pupils' education and the education they're getting at schools is blurring. And actually, I think we do need some strong research to capture that. That's not something we do at the moment, but I think it is something we'd like to work with the PTA and others on trying to get. So it'd be good to talk to you about that. Again, a lot of the BESA research we do comes out of consultation with members about particular issues they're looking at, because the market's changing so quickly at the moment. And actually that's where, for example, the Multi-Academy Trust research has come from, which we're going to launch at the start of next month. So very interested to hear your thoughts around that and how we may be able to develop that work. I don't know if Sophie or Dom know of any research.
Yeah, actually, it's a really good point. And I had noted down that the 54% of primary schools spending time in front of ICT or during their day. Some of the questions, does this include after school clubs, so coding clubs? How much is that spent in the classroom and how much is it after school? So if thinking about flipped classrooms or flipped learning. And so I think that would be really interesting to sort of get the broader picture on how it's being used.
I've been working with a client on just that, and the research is very misleading actually, because even though it may say, if you ask the child if they got a computer at home and they say yes, the actual ability for that child to actually get in front of it at the time when they need it is very variable. It may be a big brother's laptop, or it may be dad's or whatever. So the research is that there is misleading at the moment.
Every week there's a story about how children are using computers or phones, as adults call them, all the time. It's a problem. That's the kind of leitmotif running through those stories, that their exposure to this is far too great. In fact, no child ever goes outside anymore. Doesn't talk to a human being, obviously. It's important not to misinterpret that as meaning that they're using them for anything useful. There's an awful lot of kind of not very deep use of social media, and the use by schools of that resource is tiny, the actual the devices that children have. So that's another huge likely shift in these figures. I'll stick my neck out and say within 2 to 3 years, which just tends to be a kind of forward look that you can get away with saying anything. Bring your own device, hopefully, will be a real significant game changer in our schools, because most children have got a device in their pocket that is worth several £100s, that is, the oft-quoted stat, more powerful than the computer that put a man on the moon, or whatever. And generally they go into school and they're told, get it out and you're in trouble. And that's mostly because we can't control it very well. And schools are all about controlling risk, I suppose, and making sure people are focused. So once we solve that software issue of letting schools make confident use of children's devices in an safe and manageable way, then that's a huge revolution that will take place.
There's some evidence that technology actually widens the digital divide along socio-economic lines. What poor kids do with tech is very different from what middle class and wealthy kids do. How do you see that playing in the school sector? I mean, you mentioned earlier there's a big distinction between the private and academies in your chain. Is that something that we think is a problem?
I mean, I think it is important to emphasise that, just because every kid in an independent school has a tablet, it doesn't necessarily mean that the tablet is giving them a better education. Obviously, the quality of teaching is extremely important as well. But yes, and I mean, I know Justin Greening has currently put the new national funding formula on hold for another year, but there are certainly very significant imbalances at the moment in terms of both in terms of schools funding, but also in terms of ICT provision, and that's something that we definitely need to seek to address going forwards. But I think it is important to really stress that ensuring a school being fully equipped with technological resources. You can have a school that's fantastically resourced when it comes to computers, broadband provision. Every kid could have a device, and still the education and the outcomes that come out of it may not be the ones that you would want, or as effective as you would want. Technology, again, isn't necessarily the solution here. The technology has to complement strong teaching and really help the teacher be more effective at what they do, rather than necessarily trying to displace that.
So there's a couple of episodes of the EdTech podcast which I guess discuss some of these issues. The most recent one is with Kano Computing, and they talk about the Connect Home initiative in the US. So that's working with various partners to try and reach, I suppose, those people that might not be so familiar or be connected with EdTech as regularly as others. Another one in terms of a startup, and Jen, who was the founder, who was there last night, is Easy Peasy. So based here in London, and they're very much an early years startup based around that idea of school readiness and trying to close that gap. So they have actually got some really good efficacy studies that are going to come out. They've published through the University of Oxford independently. But this is something that I like to kind of question, because I think, like you say, there is sometimes it can increase that divide, and I'm not sure that we're particularly clear on what the picture is on that. But yeah, it might be worth checking those episodes out.
It's definitely a cultural problem. Chucking devices at it will widen it. You've got to have, as Patrick said, really effective use of that technology and systems for making children engage with it in a meaningful way. And that is not dependent on where they go to school. It's dependent on the culture of those schools, really. But it's a big problem for this country, I think.
Yeah, it's the culture of those people's influences. So, is there a culture of using technology broadly? Do you go into school and it's one thing, you go home and it's something completely different? So that's not an easy thing to solve. And it's probably a similar problem outside of technology with other learnings as well, I would imagine. So.
Thank you, and I think that brings us to an end for this session. And as Patrick said, the research is available via the BESA website. So now I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for speaking. A round of applause for these two folks.